It's just after midnight on November 2nd, 1968, in a quiet FBI listening post, a tape reel begins to turn. On the other end of the line, a woman is about to deliver a message. Not from a general, not from a diplomat, from a presidential campaign. 3 days later, America will vote for its next president in one of the closest elections in modern history. And somewhere in Paris, a peace deal is sitting on the table, a deal that could end a war that has already killed 30,000 Americans. You've probably heard the official story. Richard Nixon won in 1968, promising to end the Vietnam War. 4 years later, he got caught breaking into a hotel, and that scandal became the defining crime of his career. But what if that wasn't his first betrayal? What if, years before Watergate, a candidate for president quietly reached into an active peace negotiation and made sure it collapsed? The President of the United States found out. He had the evidence in his hands within days, and declassified files reveal exactly how a sitting president chose to describe what a presidential campaign had just done in words far more serious than dirty tricks. So why did he say nothing? To understand what really happened that November and what it cost, we have to go back a few weeks earlier to the moment peace actually seemed possible. By October of 1968, Lyndon Johnson was a president with nothing left to lose politically and everything left to prove historically. He wasn't running for re-election. He'd already told the country that back in March. What he wanted now was simpler, and in some ways harder to get. He wanted to be the president who ended the Vietnam War, instead of the one remembered for escalating it. And for the first time in years, that actually seemed possible. In Paris, American and North Vietnamese negotiators had been meeting for months, circling the same basic trade. The United States would stop bombing North Vietnam. In exchange, Hanoi would show restraint and agree to let South Vietnam's government sit at the table as a legitimate party to the talks. It wasn't a full peace, but it was real. It was close. And by late October, it was close enough that Johnson's own advisors believed an announcement was only days away. Paris Peace Talks. October 1968. Here's what most people don't realize about that moment. A breakthrough like this doesn't just end a war on paper. It ends careers. It reshapes elections. And in the fall of 1968, one candidate was watching those negotiations with something closer to dread than hope. Richard Nixon had spent the campaign positioning himself as the only man who could handle Vietnam. Not end it overnight, he was never that specific, but handle it. Manage it. Succeed where Johnson had failed. That message only works if the war is still unsolved on Election Day. A sudden peace, handed to the country by a Democratic administration 1 week before Americans voted, could hand the whole election to his opponent instead. So as the talks progressed, Nixon's lead in the polls began doing something his campaign hadn't planned for. It started shrinking. We know what happened next because of 4 pages of handwritten notes, sitting untouched in an archive for almost 50 years, until a biographer found them in 2016. They were written by H.R. Haldeman, one of Nixon's closest aides, during a phone call with a candidate on the night of October 22nd. In that call, Nixon gave an instruction. Keep a woman named Anna Sheno working on South Vietnam, he said. And then he asked a question that should stop you in your tracks. Is there any other way to monkey wrench it? Monkey wrench what exactly? The peace talks. The very thing that could end a war that had already cost 30,000 American lives. We'll get to what those notes do and don't prove. Historians still argue over exactly how far that instruction went. But one thing isn't in dispute. A name had just entered the story. A name almost nobody outside Washington had ever heard. And she was about to become the most important unofficial diplomat in America, working for a campaign that couldn't afford to let peace happen too soon. Anna Sheno was not a spy. She was not a government official. On paper, she was a Republican fundraiser, a well-known figure on the Washington social circuit, and the widow of a genuine American war hero, Major General Claire Sheno, who'd led the Flying Tigers against Japan in the Second World War. That name alone opened doors across Asia. And by 1968, Chennault had spent years cultivating relationships with South Vietnam's leadership that most State Department officials could only dream of, which is exactly why Nixon's campaign wanted her. A year earlier, in 1967, Nixon had personally asked Chennault to become something the campaign never called by its real name: a back-channel. Someone who could speak to Saigon when official American diplomats couldn't or shouldn't. She agreed, and over the following months, she became the connective tissue between a presidential campaign and a foreign government fighting for its survival. Anna Chennault, Nixon's unofficial ambassador. We know this wasn't a one-time favor because of two separate memoirs Chennault's own, and one written by the man on the other end of her phone calls, South Vietnam's ambassador in Washington, Bui Diem. Both describe a meeting in New York in the summer of 1968, months before the election, where Chennault sat down with Nixon himself, his campaign manager, John Mitchell, and Bui Diem. Two independent accounts, written by two people with every reason to remember that room differently, and they agree on who was in it. This is the part that should unsettle you. None of this was illegal in the way we usually think about political scandals. There was no break-in, no stolen documents, just a private citizen, quietly relaying messages between a campaign and a government at war, completely outside the view of the American public who were about to vote. And then, on October the 29th, the operation nearly fell apart in the most Washington way imaginable. Not through espionage, through gossip. A source connected to the Nixon campaign let something slip to a Wall Street economist named Alexander Sachs. What Sachs heard was specific enough to be alarming that Nixon's team was trying to convince Saigon to stay away from the Paris talks entirely. Sachs didn't sit on it. He passed it straight to Walt Rostow, Johnson's national security advisor, and Rostow took it straight to the president. That same day, something happened that made the tip impossible to ignore. South Vietnam's president, Nguyen Van Thu, abruptly refused to join the talks in Paris. No real explanation. Just a sudden, inexplicable reversal. At the exact moment, peace seemed within reach. Johnson didn't wait for more coincidences. He picked up the phone and gave an order of his own. Wiretap the South Vietnamese ambassador. Follow Anna Chennault. Find out, once and for all, whether a presidential campaign was interfering in his war. The surveillance went live in the final 8 days before America voted. And within hours, the machine Johnson had just switched on would catch something no one could explain away as coincidence, gossip, or bad timing. The wiretap picked up its first real catch on November the 2nd, just before midnight. Anna Chennault called Bui Diem, and on that recorded line, she delivered a message from someone she only referred to as her boss. Hold on, she told him, we are gonna win. Then she said it again, differently. He understands all of it. And before she hung up, she made sure the message was unmistakable. Please tell your boss to hold on. FBI Wiretap Transcript, November 2nd, 1968, 11:35 p.m. Sit with that phrasing for a second. Hold on. Not good luck. Not we support you. Hold on as in, wait. Don't move. Don't sit down at that table yet. It's the language of someone stalling a peace process on purpose, timed to the exact final days of a presidential campaign. And it wasn't an isolated signal. Around the same time, American intelligence intercepted South Vietnam's own diplomatic cables messages from Bui Diem directly to President Thieu in Saigon. In them, Bui Diem said the quiet part out loud. The longer this dragged on, he told his president, the better it would be for the Republicans and for South Vietnam's negotiating position once Nixon was in office. Two separate sources, two intelligence services, saying the exact same thing. Now put yourself in Lyndon Johnson's position for a moment. You are the sitting president of the United States. You've spent months trying to end a war that's already cost 30,000 American lives, and you're now holding physical proof that a presidential campaign has been secretly working with a foreign government to keep that war going a little longer, just long enough to win an election. Johnson didn't hesitate on what to call it. In private conversations with his closest allies and the Senate men like Richard Russell and Everett Dirksen Johnson, used a word that carries real legal weight, not just political outrage. Treason, he wasn't guessing. He wasn't speculating for effect. He had wiretap transcripts, intercepted cables, and a timeline that lined up too perfectly to be coincidence. By any reasonable standard, Lyndon Johnson believed a candidate for President of the United States had just broken the law to win an election. If you are the kind of person who finds these buried moments where history's most consequential decisions get made in total secrecy, far from any camera or headline more compelling than the version taught in school, this is exactly the kind of story we dig into here. Stay with us, because what Johnson does with this evidence next is almost harder to believe than the wiretap itself. Because here's the part that should stop you cold. Johnson had the tapes. He had the cables. He had a president's own private verdict on what they meant. And 3 days later, America went to the polls and heard nothing about any of it. So why did the man who called it treason say nothing? The answer isn't cowardice. It's something colder, self-preservation. Because to expose Nixon, Johnson would have had to admit exactly how he'd gotten his proof. FBI wiretaps on a foreign embassy, NSA intercepts of another government's private cables, surveillance authorized by a sitting president against his political opponent's campaign in the final days of an election. Johnson's cabinet looked at that evidence and reached a grim, practical conclusion. You cannot accuse a man of stealing an election using intelligence you gathered by breaking the rules yourself. Nobody comes out of that clean. Not even the accuser. So Johnson buried it. And 3 days later, Richard Nixon won the presidency by roughly 500,000 votes out of more than 70 million cast, one of the narrowest margins in modern American history. Could the truth have changed that outcome? No one can prove it either way, and we won't pretend otherwise. But here's what we can prove. The public went to the polls without the one piece of information that might have mattered most. The X envelope. Sealed 1973. Open 1994, the man who kept the evidence was Walt Rostow, Johnson's national security advisor. He held on to the entire file wiretap logs, cables, memos, and years later, at the height of the Watergate hearings, he sealed it inside an envelope and handed it to the LBJ Presidential Library. On the outside, in his own handwriting, a single scrawled label, the X envelope. It stayed sealed for over 2 decades. Nobody opened it until 1994. And even that wasn't the whole story. In 2016, a separate discovery surfaced those Haldeman notes we mentioned earlier, sitting untouched in the Nixon Library's own archives since the campaign itself. Historians still argue over exactly what Nixon meant by monkey wrench. Some say it's a smoking gun, others say the context is murkier than it first appears. That debate isn't settled, and it probably never fully will be. What isn't in dispute is that the back channel existed, that Nixon ordered it kept running, and that Johnson believed, in his own words, that it amounted to treason. What is measurable is the cost of the years that followed. 21,000 more Americans didn't come home between 1969 and 1973. Hundreds of thousands more Vietnamese lives ended alongside them. 4 more years of war, through Cambodia, through Laos, through a Christmas bombing campaign, before a peace agreement finally arrived in Paris in January of 1973. And by the judgment of many historians who've compared both deals side by side, it wasn't dramatically different from the peace that had already been sitting on the table years before. Rostow himself seemed to sense the weight of what he was sealing away. In a note attached to that envelope, he wrote that the real link between 1968 and the Watergate scandal unraveling around him was simple. That time, he wrote, they got away with it. Rostow's words still land like an accusation. written by a man who was actually in the room. But an accusation isn't proof, and the uncomfortable truth is that history like this rarely hands you a signed confession. The evidence rarely arrives as a signed confession. It arrives as a wiretap transcript, a sealed envelope, a set of handwritten notes nobody was supposed to find, each one a fragment. None of them the whole picture, all of them pointing in the same direction. What we do know is this. A peace process that could have ended a war years early collapsed at the exact moment it threatened an election. The man who uncovered the plot called it treason in private, then chose silence, overexposure. And the war that followed that silence claimed tens of thousands more lives, American and Vietnamese. Spread across 4 more years, nobody watching in 1968 could have predicted. That's the real inheritance of the Cold War, not just missiles pointed at cities, or spies trading secrets in the dark. It's this, a willingness, at the very highest levels of power, to treat a war's continuation as an acceptable cost of winning. And somewhere in Washington, that envelope sat sealed for 25 years not because the truth was lost, but because it was inconvenient. To the men who could have told it,